So welcome everyone to today's NTP Partners and Schools Roundtable, which will be chaired by St. Burkett, who is a former lead inspector at Ofsted, a former head teacher of 14 years, and an involvement in education that has spanned over 30 years. St. has advised QT since its very earliest days, and alongside Adrian Conway, heads up Neon Learning and the NPQ Online team within. Now, as for our panelists, we are joined by Johnny Barnsley and Beatrice Vincent from the hugely successful Manning's Tutors. We will be joined by Debbie Constantinou, who is lead tutor at EM Tuition, and we'll be drawing on Debbie's 20 years experience in the school environment today as well. Action Tutoring interim CEO Jen Fox is also here with us too. Thank you very much, Jen, for joining us. As one of the 4 providers of the pioneering online tutoring pilot scheme, Action Tutoring have been at the forefront of progress in the deployment of tutors in schools to aid with learning since last spring. And our final panelist is Sharon Cawley, who is the founder and director of Conexus Tuition. Sharon's online community, Life After Teaching, Exit the Classroom and Thrive, has helped over 21,000 teachers and educators take their next steps in their professional career. And it was only established in spring of last year. So we are very happy to be joined by our panelists, and several of our partners have brought along champion schools with them to join us at this event, including George McWilliams, who has been working with Manning Tutors as part of the NTP programme. So welcome to all of our partners and our schools, and I will now hand over to St. Burkett, who will be chairing this roundtable.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody want to add to their introduction before we get started? Having a look at some of our questions. No, fantastic. Okay, we can head straight in then. We're looking at some of the themes around the NTP tuition questions, which will be the evaluation of the programme. But obviously, we're very early in it, so what we're looking at is not what the answers are going to be. It's what your experience can tell us and what you know already, using your vast knowledge that you have, or we have sitting around the table. What is a way forwards? And we'd be asking the same questions of tutors as well, or similarly phrased questions. So just to kick us off then, how do you know, or how have you known in the past, what difference tutors make to the learning of the pupils that they work with? What is there that you've measured, or what is there that tells you? So Johnny, let's start with you.
Start with this. George is actually a very good guest to have with us today, because
he is, yeah.
with his school in particular, we have decided to have a sort of initial assessment and final assessment for all the pupils taking part in the tuition. It's not planned to be, super rigid, like a sort of very serious examination, but it's going to look at topics that the tutors have been working on with the students over the course of the tuition, starting with obviously the same topics in both the initial and final assessment, and looking at improvement across 15 weeks, or 15 hours, I should say. It's going to look at obviously the sort of numerical improvements, but also what I think is going to be quite nice is we're going to also ask the students to assess themselves and how much they feel their confidence has improved, if they feel like the tuition has made them more able to approach the questions, even if hopefully their ability in the actual question has improved as well. But that's going to be interesting to see how the students actually feel about it.
Okay, so George, what else has tutoring brought to the students that you've noticed so far?
It's a sort of it's kind of different for every student, really. You've got a kind of spectrum of the impact that it's had, whereas you'll get some 15-year-old boys who've fallen in love with their female tutors and are going to be very bereft when they no longer see them. I'm not joking. It's almost like an emotional attachment that's formed between them. So you've got that on that one hand, and then you've got others who've sat in sit in those sessions who've not engaged, who struggle to engage in the not quotes normal classrooms anyway, and find, and they've still got the same barriers to learning that they had, whether they're doing tutoring or not. So it's not a golden bullet, but for certain students, it is an amazing tool of that they've been able to express themselves and overcome their barriers just through that intimacy of quite small groups. Even if it's 1 to 3, it doesn't need to be 1 to 1. 1 to 3 is, you know, small enough that they felt that they could talk about what was challenging them with their Macbeth scripts or whatever it might be, or that area of maths. So that was a bit of a wonder there, but I don't know if I answered your question, St. John, but anyway, how'd it go?
Yeah, well, I think, well let's ask Sharon. In your experience, going back in your experience, not just NTP, but all tutoring, what does tutoring bring? Is there an element that needs to be brought before pupils, students learn well? Is there something that tutoring can bring above that academic learning?
I think we've had a huge win this year with tutoring, and I've talked about this at great length. We've taken a word that had massive connotations before the NTP, tutoring. And tutoring, it was almost like, it was like a red flag to a head teacher sometimes. They didn't want to hear that their kids had tutors. Some parents felt that tutoring was the preserve of the elite and they couldn't afford it for their kids. So tutoring in many ways has been something that's been a bit of a hot potato. It's something that's kept almost behind a whispered hand on a touch line. My lad's he's got a maths tutor. Well, where are you doing that? I think what tutoring has brought to pupils and parents and schools now is it's sort of like ripped off this cloak of uncertainty, and it's seen very much as a synergy business, a synergy service that can work alongside schools, teachers, parents and kids to improve. There isn't a one size fits all where tutoring is concerned, and sometimes we talk about it as if it's one thing. Tutoring can be 1-to-1, 1-to-3, 1-to-6. It can be online, it can be face-to-face, it can be in school, it can be after school. And if we're not careful, it just becomes this catch-all that we talk about. So I think it's really important that when we are talking about tutoring to parents and tutoring to head teachers, and that's what the NTP has been brilliant at, it's offering you a range so that when our head teacher here talked about it didn't quite work with one kid, but it did with another, but those kids had exactly the same barriers. We have got a raft of stuff out there now that we can choose where tutoring's concerned. It might not work for a year 10 lad doing it for an hour after school while his mates are playing football on the field and he can see it. But it would work online with one of Jen's tutors on a 1-to-1 at period 3 in a day. We've got to bring tutoring in all its wealth of services and provisions and provide parents and children and head teachers with the full menu that we have on offer. And then when we do that, you'll really see the difference that it makes, because our head teacher here said there isn't a golden bullet, but there's loads of different golden bullets we can make where tutoring is concerned if we seize this opportunity and get it right at this moment in time.
Okay, let's bring, as Jen's been mentioned then, let's bring Jen in. Okay, so what was said was that 1-to-1 with one of your tutors would work. What's meant by working with, if tutoring is working? How do you know that it's been successful? What is there in that 1-to-1 session which would enable you to say, yeah, my tutor has been successful with the student?
I think when we think about, I guess what you're alluding to there is measuring the impact that the tutors are having. We see it as kind of three things. You've got, for that individual pupil, what difference does it make in the exam grade? You know, if you're working with a cohort that has that fixed point at the end, that is the exam, the ultimate pass-fail measure of how they did on that day. That's one way of looking at, did it make a difference? But it's not the only way, because Johnny, you were talking about the kind of pre and post assessments, so the kind of internal measures you can do, and they can be huge, look like the real GCSEs, they could look like the SAT exams, or they can just be those, regular assessments that you do and you repeat and you see the progress over time. So is that within program tracking of individual progress. But I think the piece that's much harder to measure, but actually I think longer term has the biggest impact, is the attitude and the confidence that comes with it. And tutoring has a really robust amount of evidence behind it, saying when it's done well, it has huge impact on academics. But actually the thing that I think the pupils we work with carry along with them into the next stage of their life is that confidence to put up their hand or hand in that piece of homework. And one of my favorite stories from a few years ago now was a school in actually North London. We were talking about North London a moment ago. And it was a year 11 boy who nothing had worked for. It was unfortunately counting down the days until he was done in that school. And the school decided to just put him on our program as a kind of final bit of effort. And you know what? He came some sessions, he didn't come to others. He engaged somewhat. He wasn't fabulous. It was an okay relationship. But what changed was his maths teacher came and found the tutor after one of the sessions and said, what are you doing with him? Something's shifting. And the tutor's like, oh, what do you mean? What's changed? Has he got a great grade? Like, oh, no, he completely failed his test, but he gave me his first year 11 maths homework.
Yeah.
And that was the difference. It was the kind of shift in his mentality to go, you know what, I might not be perfect, but I'm going to try and see if this doesn't work. Well, it's not going to be, I can take it, I can learn from it. So confidence and that attitude is also something I think all of our tutors instill in the pupils they're working with.
Just staying with you, Jen, on that one then. So these are sort of preconditions for learning, that without having these elements in place, the learning's not going to happen. Would that be a way of putting it?
Yeah, well, I think we can look to ourselves as well. What do we need in a relationship or a circumstance to really make the most of it? And there's things about feeling safe and feeling trust. The same works with our pupils and tutors. So, respecting that person's kind of subject knowledge, but also having that relationship and that rapport where it's a safe place to make mistakes and to know that that's okay, that's part of the learning, but also to lighten it up. And I think I used to be a classroom teacher, and what you can't do is that personalized motivation in your hour-long classroom with 30 pupils, but you can in tutoring. You can see when they need a pause or when they need that little break or when they need that boost of motivation. I think that's the important benefit of doing it in much smaller groups.
Okay, well, let's bring Beatrice in if she's up to it, because she just had a COVID jab, so suffering a bit. But that personal relationship, how just tell me a bit about the importance of that, Beatrice, and the validity for a tutor going in and forming that professional relationship with the student they're working with.
I mean, I think that's the sort of thing that really can't kind of be undersold in tuition. And when Jen was telling the story, I was reminded of, in fact, my very first job that I had with Mannings before I worked in head office. I was a tutor, and the first job I was assigned was a girl, and we didn't have very much time before her English exam, and we walked into sort of the first session. I think it was maybe sort of 4 or 5 weeks before her English exam, and one of the questions she asked me in that session was, "Who's Macduff?"
Yeah.
On her Macbeth paper, and I was kind of like, okay, this is where we're at this point. Yeah. And I like to think that I helped her get a good grade in her exam, or a better grade than she might have otherwise got in her exam. But I also kind of like to think that in our very last session, because it was the year that the syllabus all changed, and there suddenly weren't very many past papers to work from. And so for the language one, I just brought in a book from home, one of my favorite books, and did the sort of unseen text with her just from that book, and made up my own questions sort of thing with her. And that I found was the most rewarding session, because I spoke to her about this book because I felt so passionately about it. And she said, "Oh, Miss, what's the name of this book?" And she wrote down the title and she walked away. And that, even though it was quite frustrating, because I was like, no, this is our last session and I finally feel like we're getting somewhere, I also feel like that, you know, me being able to bring that element of myself and share that with her might be something that now she would go away and she might be interested in that book and read that book. And, you know, her love for English and for reading might be fostered outside of exams, which obviously are important, but you know, that was my real takeaway from that, was being able to share something of myself with her that probably doesn't get shared so much in a kind of classroom environment.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's ask Johnny to pick up on that a bit and move that on. So the importance of knowing the syllabus when you're working with secondary student, as opposed to knowing the principles that you're working to as a tutor, does one have precedence over the other?
It's a good question. I think both are so important. It's difficult to choose. I'm a little bit biased. Because I'm a mathematician, and a big problem in maths teaching in general is that not a lot of mathematicians want to become maths teachers. And so maths teachers tend to be people from outside of maths who didn't necessarily choose the subject because they love maths and only maths. And what you tend to end up with people who know the syllabus very, very well, but they do know the subject as well. That's not quite what I'm implying, but they don't kind of love it and understand it to the same level of depth that a mathematician would. Someone who chose to study maths at university and so on. And I think it does make a huge difference, actually. That said, I think someone who is a fantastic mathematician and doesn't know the syllabus at all is also going to be quite ineffectual with pupils. We see that a lot as well with tutors, brilliant minds who come in and make quite simple mistakes when it comes to the teaching aspect of it. It's really important to know the various tools that some pupils will be learning in school as to how to approach problems. Lots of schools have different kind of approved methods for solving problems, which can become quite frustrating when it's different with different schools. And you've sort of got to remember, okay, this school does it this way, they have SOHCAHTOA, whereas this school does it a different way. But knowing the ins and outs of those is really important, because you really don't want to confuse pupils. You don't want to be crossing wires with their mainline education in school. That can be really disastrous if that happens. So yeah, I probably have to go with the syllabus, but it makes me quite sad as a mathematician and an academic to say that, because I think both are so important. I would definitely wouldn't understate the importance of knowing your subjects completely inside out, and obviously having that incredible passion for it as well.
Okay, so where do the tutors get that information from? Is that easily available to them, say a maths syllabus?
Yeah, I mean, the syllabi in general are all available online, and they're not particularly nice to read through. They're generally sort of like 50-page documents, of which about sort of 5 are probably relevant for the kind of topics and things that they need to be aware that they should be focusing on. But there are sort of tools out there as well for introducing tutors to the sort of general methods and the ideas behind teaching these things, but they're not that great, actually. They're not, at least in terms of maths that I've seen, it's generally just a sort of topics list, and there's not a great resource for how do you teach this. There's a lot of how do you learn this, but not how do you teach this. So that could be potentially a gap in the market for something along those lines.
So prior knowledge is a useful thing to have in how to teach different aspects of maths.
And experience. That's, I mean, mostly how I picked it up. I definitely went in pretty naive and learned a lot about what worked and what didn't by working with pupils. I can say that my lessons have evolved massively from when I started. I think sort of coming out of university, especially if you've been doing sort of postgraduate stuff, it's a huge swing to go back to trying to teach GCSE pupils how to pass their GCSE maths. And you sort of, there's a bit of a recalibration period where you're sort of trying to figure out exactly what it is that needs to be, exactly what the sort of, behind every pupil who can't answer a question, there's a particular problem that needs to be solved by the tutor or the teacher.
Yeah.
What exactly is it that's holding them back here? It's often something really specific, and it's a total mystery until you explore it a little bit and figure that out. And that's kind of the fun of tutoring.
Yeah, and I've got them in comments here. Helen's written, humanising us as tutors in a way that the classroom teachers often can't do. Well, she put don't do, but I suspect it's can't do when you've got one person in front of you as opposed, or up to 3 as opposed to 30. And she's also written lots of students don't like taking maths either. So perhaps that's something, humanising it and perhaps popularising it with students. Okay, let's just ask George, can there be a disconnect between, you just heard what Johnny's been saying, so can there be a disconnect between what a school's trying to achieve through tutoring and what tutors may come in and expect to achieve?
Yeah, they can, and it can work both ways. I'll give an example. This year we've got, as Johnny was saying, we've had a head of maths was saying to me, we've got some students, George, who are foundation students, but they're being taught skills for level 8 materials and stuff. So the tutor had gone above the expectation of maths. Now I was a bit reluctant to kind of jump on the tutors there, because I think the tutors were actually trying to be aspirational and to push the students, and sometimes departments and schools can dampen expectations over a kind of 5-year journey about what students are capable of. So I vetted some of those complaints, because I thought, no, good on the tutor. There'll be no harm in them being exposed to higher level stuff. They won't get to use it if they're doing a foundation paper. So yeah, and the other issue Johnny said is a live one as well, not so much in English but in maths, that there are these tools and tricks and techniques that they use in maths that they build up over the years, and then a new tutor comes in. But I think good tutors pick that up and usually check which technique are you used to using, and by having sort of little strategies like that when they embark on new stuff, they pretty much work out quickly the techniques to use. But it's interesting, especially that one about the aspiration, that sometimes the tutor can be more aspirational because it's fresh eyes on a student in the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Let's just ask Jen. Okay, I've been just had a short focus on maths, but let's think about tutoring across different ages, because it's been a bit secondary based, but you're doing tutors covering all different ages. Is there a differing impact between, say, tutoring a primary pupil and tutoring a key stage 4 pupil?
Yeah, so we work with year 5, 6s, 7s, 10s and 11s. So we don't work with the really little ones, but in my experience, the impact is really similar in terms of grades. I think actually where the bigger differentiation we see is how much impact you can make in maths in a 15-week block compared to what you can do in an English subject. They're just the two we work in. And so it's almost the pace of progress, and similar to what you're mentioning there, George, about methods in maths, and if it mirrors what's going on in the classroom, actually you can fix one little small element and that can unlock quite a lot of progress in maths. Whereas English and reading and comprehension is built up over years of sustained building vocabulary, how you infer, and how you build skills to critically analyze pieces. And I think we see a difference in progress in subject rather than age group, in our experience anyway.
Yeah, okay. And Sharon, what about across different subjects? Is there varying impact? Sort of Jen hinted at it then.
We've seen things differently. We've seen more of an impact in primary, irrespective of subject, than we have in secondary, and that's come down to engagement. In our experience, the primary schools have allowed us to come into school within curriculum time, and that has had a far bigger impact in terms of engagement, attendance, progress measures than secondary heads who've been reluctant in many ways to remove the children from the curriculum timetable and have had the tutoring take place in isolation out of school. And as such, particularly when you get to the top end of Key Stage 4, you have more disengaged, hard to reach learners who are the very ones who need tuition the most. So it's not necessarily been a subject base, it has been I think primary school children engage more with that level of attention. They see it as a reward, they're going out. You know, we've had our tutors go to the classroom door to get their 3 children and it's pick me, can I go with them? That is not the case in secondary schools because there's almost a perception, why am I being asked to stay behind after school? What? So our experience has been that we have seen huge leaps in numeracy and literacy because primary school teachers in the main have had us in the afternoon. The children have had their core curriculum learning in the morning, and then we've gone in between the hours of 1 to 3. Secondary schools in the main, some have had us in and children have been taken out on a rolling programme, but in the main secondary schools have asked us to come in after school, and that's been a particularly hard sell.
How do you square that circle then? Because secondary schools can't put all their maths and English into the mornings. It's got to be timetabled throughout the day. So is there a solution? Well,
it's a rolling programme. I would argue that there's a reluctance to take children out of curriculum time. And I understand why, because I was working in the days before 2015 when the GCSEs shifted. And from about February onwards, you'd stand there as an English teacher and you'd say, where's Luke Brown? Oh, he's off timetable today. He's doing his PE BTEC course. Yeah. So I know why senior leadership teams and head teachers drew a line in the sand and said, we're not devaluing curriculum subjects anymore by taking children out. We want this to take place outside of school. But what I would suggest is, if you've got a year 9 boy or a year 8 boy in your school whose literacy levels have been depleted so badly because they were never where they should have been to begin with, the pandemic's held him back even further. Put 15 hours of tuition in over 3 weeks. Take him out 1 o'clock every day. So he doesn't just get hit for all the same lessons over a 15-week period. Take him out for 3 weeks at 1 o'clock. So he misses it on a rotational basis.
Yep.
And then measure his reading age. Because whilst you're keeping him in history and he can't even read the name Cardinal Wolsey because he can't decode it, put him in with a phonics teacher from primary school, get his reading age measured, because he needs a reading age of 16, and pull him out for 15 hours of phonics. And then that way, when he goes back into learning about the Amazon basin or whatever it is they do, he can at least read it. Yeah. And that's where we've come across a real sticking point with our secondaries. They've made a decision beforehand. And also what they want is they almost want a one size fits all. Actually, we've had some of our best sessions take place with children online, 30 children online in a room, Hazelden High School.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Some kids work best first thing in the morning. Some kids, like the after school, they don't want to be taken out. But in the main, why we've had success with primary schools is because they've let us have the children in the day so they don't feel as though it's an add-on, but a part of.
Okay, that's brilliant. So Beatrice, how do you find it at Manning's? Do you find the same issues, and how do you get over those, or how do your tutors get over those organisational issues?
It is a pretty big sticking point as far as I've seen. I think Johnny would potentially be slightly more knowledgeable than me in terms of like setting things up with the schools, but I do know that we've kind of struggled, that all of our schools, because we do very much predominantly work with secondary schools, have said, oh, we want it after school, straight away after school. And obviously we simply don't have the tutor capacity to give every school their sessions after school. Like that simply doesn't work. And also, like, personally, I really agree with Sharon, especially considering just how much all of our secondary in particular students are being asked to do for their education, and the amount of time they're being asked to spend on it. Obviously it's incredibly important, but you know, these are growing bodies who are going through a lot of things, you know, emotionally as well, and they're already in school from sort of for most of their day, and really challenging their brains in that time, and you know, really tiring themselves out, and then they're going home and doing homework, and to ask them to then additionally do an extra hour or 2 hours of tuition, no matter how fantastic that tutor in that session is, if you're being given a student who's kind of burnt out, especially sort of on a Friday afternoon. I mean, we are rarely asked to do Friday afternoon tuition, just because
or Beatrice,
everyone knows.
Child who won't attend.
Yeah.
You can have the best party planned in the world, and that child's on his toes over the fence going, I'm not going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we've come unstuck with engagement, because they've voted with their feet after school and will not come.
Yeah, completely. We've found that as well. Our attendance has I think been one of the biggest barriers, and I think Johnny would be able to say yes or no to this, but I believe our attendance has been much worse for schemes where we've said this is an after school thing, this is in addition to school, rather than the ones where we've said this is something that's going on instead of your period 3 on a Wednesday.
Let's ask Johnny, what it has worked really well in setting things up with schools?
I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. Definitely having pupils around in school and being able to sort of grab, if they forget their lesson or they don't go for whatever reason, just being able to go and grab them and put them in a different classroom is so helpful compared to like the evening sessions, or where we were back in January and February, with absolutely no control or idea where our pupils were or what they were doing. If they weren't in the lesson, then you were totally lost and you had no course of action. So yes, having them during the school day has been massive. It has been really helpful.
One of the best things we did as a setup, we asked for our lead contact person for the NTP not to be on your senior leadership team. We don't want your Senko, we don't want your deputy head. We want a really well organised TA who would alphabeticalise a bookshelf while they were sat waiting, talking to me. And the TAs are the best person to have as your lead contact, because your Senkos run off the feet, the deputy heads are run off the feet, the head teacher's almost inaccessible once they've signed the MOU because they are so busy. Get a TA to coordinate with you, and we've had phenomenal responses. They are the ones who are absolutely the heroes of what's gone on during this pandemic, because they hold everything together. And more often than not, with your hard to reach kids, they're the ones who they've got the relationships with. So from an operational point of view of setting things up, we've gone, give us your leadership team to do all the nuts and bolts of the setup, but give us classroom teachers, TAs, and let's get that liaison working there. And we've had TAs text messaging, mobile phones, and that's what's worked best when schools have knocked it. I'm not saying in terms of status, but when they've palmed this off to people who are on the ground, that's when it's worked best for us.
Fantastic. I'll chip in there from the point of view of inspection. When you go into a school and everybody turns up, all the children turn up when they're meant to at the time, you know you're in a pretty good school.
Yeah.
Yeah. straight away, and others I can be sitting there waiting. So George, you've been listening to that. From your perspective, what works really well for your students? What sort of system and setup works well?
Well, we've kept it simple in that, like we said before, we're very reluctant to take any students out of normal curriculum time. So we use a PE slot, which is a double period, to get the students out, and that works well. We've got like 15 minutes where you can get them into a computer suite, you can get them their headphones and their cameras sorted, and there's a bit of a warm-up before the session begins, and there's a bit of a warm down at the end as well. So that way of doing it, I mean, there's always ups and downsides with it, but that happening during the school day, I just wouldn't go there in terms of after school. It's challenging enough to get 60 students a week. Well, actually, we've got 120 students split across 2 companies that are accessing the tutoring in a week, and having 120 at the right place at the right time, even though it is PE, when they quite often rather be in PE as well. That's a bit of a challenge. But that works tolerably well. But I think Sharon's point's a really good one about, and we've been thinking about this. We've had a kind of piecemeal approach of having members of staff who happen to be free at certain times. They will go in and cover it, because you obviously have to have students for safeguarding supervised by a member of staff. But you're right, Sharon. If you've got somebody that owns it and they're badgering students and chasing the ones that aren't in, and it needs that. And also, and if it's somebody who's got a kind of specialism in maths or English, whichever's been running, and they're putting their nose in to what's going on and seeing it, and just keeping an eye on the shoulder of students, then you get so much more back from it. So schools will get.
I can't begin to tell you the difference it's made when we've had those boots on the ground, because they're the ones who are saying, do you know, no kids have turned up here? And particularly if you've got a really good grassroots TA who says who collars the head teacher and goes, hey, you're wasting your money here. And is holding that level to account, because we know how pressured teachers are at the best of time. Your heads of department, your deputies, your Senkos, you task somebody with this as the responsibility. It's made a massive, massive difference.
And you're getting a lot of support in the chat that's coming up as well.
It's a really good point. I mean, but it's a hidden cost of the tutoring that's not factored in properly. I think that it's 75% funded. It's from the catch-up fund. It's all great, but no, you're going to need to staff those appropriately, and that's another cost in there that you factor it in, because it's a real cost. So you won't get value back unless you've got that in place. And then Mannings and Johnny have been great in terms of you build up a sort of relationship over time, so that the tutors will contact the lead person there, and they'll just get involved and shift kids around and rethink the blend of the students that are working together, so that when that goes well, you've got a really good partnership on the go.
Yeah. Okay. Let's bring Jen in for Jen's thoughts. So Jen, can you give me your thoughts on that, and can you also just give me a comparison, because going back in time, talking about the NTP, but also going back in time, what's the different impact between working with a tutor in the school and working with a tutor at home?
Yeah, so Action Tutoring's been working with schools for 10 years, into our 11th year at the moment. And over that time, we've become very knowledgeable about what we're talking about here, the allies you need in school, needing the support from the school community to rally the pupils to sessions and see tutoring as valuable. So when school closures happened in January, we shifted to have home-based tutoring, which was completely new for us. We've never worked with parents before. We've always worked via schools. It was quite an interesting experience, because firstly, could see massive benefits from those young people being at home. For those who did have a quiet space, it was much easier to concentrate and not have the distraction of friends in the room that might be there in the classroom. Tutors felt that connection, were able to build rapport in a different way. But on the flip side, and kind of champion the disadvantaged, we couldn't reach everyone who needed it. And actually the pupils who needed it most were the least likely to be able to access it from home. So we reached about 70% of our almost 5,000 pupils through home-based tutoring during those weeks of school closures. But we know that 30% that we couldn't, for either logistical reasons or parents not permitting it or not willing to engage, they're likely the ones who would have required it more than most. So benefits and challenges of those. And just talking about kind of barriers more generally, I think working with schools and running tuition with schools requires breaking down psychological barriers as much as it does logistical. So you've got the logistics of detention runs at the same time as the session, and you need a mechanism to get someone out of detention so they don't miss their tutoring. And you need a head teacher who says, actually, that's more beneficial than them sitting in a room on their own for an hour. You've got logisticals, they're a young carer or they pick up their younger sibling from school, they have to leave at the end of the school day. Those are individual. But what I think you can do is the psychological ones about, why I want to leg it at the end of school, like Sharon mentioned. That's when you need to rally the troops in school to find the teacher that resonates with that young person, who says, that head of PE or the football coach that says, no, you should be doing maths if, you need to go to maths tuition. How was maths tuition last week? And building it in so pupils see it as part of their schooling, they're just normal schooling, and it takes a while and time to build that culture.
But don't you think, Jen, that what you've just talked about there, breaking down those the parent, if you've got the parent at the heart of this as well, and the best setups that we've had is when they've sold it to the parents. Mm-hmm. They've really got, so actually if that child appears because they've jumped over the fence and the mother goes, what are you doing at home? It's Thursday, you've got your tutoring. But sometimes the parents haven't even known why they've been staying or how much the school has invested. And they just think it's some after school club that the kids have got to attend. Not that you've got a really brilliant tutor there. You've got a school that wants them to go. I think the parent needs to be at the heart of what's going on here.
I agree, but I think the challenge is that the majority of, sorry, not the majority, a proportion of the parents of the young people that we serve through the NTP are ones who have had really poor experience of education themselves. So they may wish the best for their children, but they may not know what that practically looks like, support. And as well, it may be that, when you're doing this via a school, there's an extra layer between you and the parents. So you are dependent on how much you influence the school to influence the parents. So that can be a challenge as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just ask Johnny. Let's move that on a little bit. So Jen just mentioned the disadvantage there. So Johnny, how do you know that a pupil that has been experiencing, had a tutor, been on the tutoring program, how do you know they're actually learning more than a pupil that hasn't, that's just been in the classroom?
We talked about assessment, initial and final assessments earlier on. It's probably a fair bit of overlap with that discussion. We have done pretty broad numerical analysis before. This is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of what we've done this year, but it is possible to come up with a metric of exactly how much a student has improved versus the aggregate for the entire year group. Doesn't work so well if the majority of the year group is having tuition. It's normally more like in years past where only a few pupils have been receiving tuition out of a much larger year group. Then it's quite easy to sort of look at their progress versus everybody else and say, yes, they've gained 30% extra grades over the other pupils that haven't been receiving this tuition and so on, or versus previous progress and things like that. we're talking.
We'll move that on then, and so you've got a pupil. Okay, they come along for their tuition. They know that they're missing playing out on the rec with their mates or whatever. You've got to persuade them that this is worthwhile. We've heard of various number of ways that can happen. You know, parents helping and all that. What is there that the tutor can do that makes it worthwhile for them? You know, you've got a professional relationship. What else can they do to say, right, okay, by being here, you're going to be better prepared for your life in future, tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. That's the kind of skill of tutoring and teaching, is how do you motivate your students to engage?
I always say to parents when we're dealing with private tutoring, and I always say to schools, it's your responsibility to get that child to us the first time. It's our responsibility to make them want to come back. So you can only take a dog to the vets once, and if they don't like it, you've got to drag them back in the next time. So what goes on in that room and around that table is dynamite. And depending upon the age of the child you've got in front of you, there's so much you can do. One of the quickest wins that you can have with a Key Stage 4 child is, what's your next assessment touch point? What are you planning doing next? What mock have you got coming up? Right, kid, let's crack this together. And then if you show that there's if you just pluck a subject out of thin air and go, right, let's do complex sentences. No, right, you've got a paper 1 coming up, writing, 40 marks. Here you go, here's 12 and you give them an investment in what they're doing. The personality of the tutor's great. Don't send Doreen in with a bag of knitting and some flip-flops who's going to bore them, right? Get high frequency praise, charismatic teachers going in there who engage with the kids, who then skill them up towards their next assessment touch point. Because if you ever want to measure impact on how well a tutor's done, get that kid to go into the exam. Get them to come out and say it was dead easy. Because half the problem we have at the moment, particularly with GCSE, is the kids are getting content after content after content. They sit in the exam, they haven't got a clue how to answer the questions. And if you can just start to ignite that spark of this is doable, get them to us once, and then it's our job to get them to come back. And that's when you have the best impact on tutoring.
Okay, let's go over to George, because he's going to...
Yeah.
George, before you do, can I just read what Hazel's written?
Yeah.
But in tutoring maths, I find a tension between trying to form the student as a mathematical thinker and learner, long-term process, and improving their grades.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you can't focus too much on grades, it doesn't really, just doesn't work to go entirely with the sort of the stick method, or if you don't focus on your tuition, if you don't practice your maths, then you're not going to do well in your exam. There needs to be some kind of encouragement from behind as well, and understanding maths better, becoming a better mathematician. That should be enjoyable in itself. And so, yeah, having both of those things simultaneously, and as Sharon was touching on as well, once you get that initial bit of progress, if you can just get a pupil to in their first lesson to understand something that they couldn't previously do in maths, it's very possible in one lesson to do that with maths. It's nicely compartmentalized into different topics. You just focus on one thing, and after an hour, they can now answer a question they couldn't answer before. That's huge in the whole scope of the tuition, because then a pupil comes away and says, I can do this. Like this GCSE seemed completely unattainable to me before. Now I can see that I can break it up into these individual topics. I've just done one. I couldn't do it before. I can do now. There's about 58 other topics to go. Let's get cracking.
Because what you've said there, John, is right.
Yeah.
What's going on with these kids is fear of getting it wrong. Absolute paralyzed with fear of going in a classroom. They've got a churning going on in the stomach because they might not be able to even read what's in front of them. They want to do, intrinsically, a kid wants to please and wants to do well. But if they are being disabled because of gaps in learning, that's where the problem comes. The minute you boost them And I always say, right, put your hand up in class and suggest this about Macbeth. Blow her socks off. And they go, oh, Sharon, she loved it. And then you start that kind of confidence boost where actually what they can do is they see that the buzz that they get of success within the classroom. And like what Johnny just said, it then builds in momentum and it can become an unstoppable force, really. You can create monsters where they've got their hand up all the time. And that's what you want from really, really good tuition.
Right, we've got, so thank you for that, Sharon. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I really want George to have the time he needs to give us his comment.
I begin by saying, yeah, I want to redo my GCSEs, and Sharon, could you be my tutor, please? You just sound like
£35 an hour. I can't do it for any less. I'll give you my number.
I'm pupil premium though. Could I get a discount, please?
We'll see what we can do for you.
Yeah, in terms of assessment, Manning's, I went with Manning's because they told me that they were going to do an assessment at the start and an assessment at the end. Now, not all the tutoring companies do that, but it should be the default, I think, that they say to the secondary schools or primary schools, we will give you a clear assessment, we'll baseline it, and we'll give you, and you can take it as you want. I mean, you can be sure that all the other schools will be trying to work out the impact of that work as well. So Johnny will test our kids again, and we'll get their assessment of the progress, and we'll do our own assessment of how those kids have done relative to the ones that didn't do the progress. And then my second point, though, I think probably more important, but Sharon's point really is that because of lockdown and that missing of a half term, all the secondary schools now with their current year 10 pupils have been plugging away at content, just trying to catch up with the skills stuff, taking a back seat. But just because we've not heard from the exam boards about what's going to happen next year, so we'll cover our bases. We'll do skills stuff in year 11, but that should be the kind of focus for the tutors next year, building up those skills rather than the content and working closely. So say, for example, if it's history, it's rather than giving them more on the American West or Weimar Republic, let's just practice exam question week in, week out. That's what the schools will be wanting, I would say.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions though there. If it's going to be a beginning and an end assessment, Elizabeth says, Helen says, is that within the 15 sessions? So
yeah, that's what you'd want. I know it takes out the time, but I think kids as well. The kids like to know, and if you can build that into feedback to the students as well, just further incentivizes the work, I think. Yeah, okay. So thanks, George. Just want to ask Beatrice, if a tutor turns up at a school and the school are not organised and the tutor's left kicking their heels, what should the tutor do?
I think that actually, as George was talking about how the assessment kind of takes away from learning time, I think in practice actually that's arguably not true. I think that actually it saves on teaching time, because if you do an assessment at the beginning, what you've got there is a very solid piece of evidence that says, right, this is my students' strengths and this is their weaknesses. And often, I've turned up at some schools and sort of gone, all right, kids, what are we reading? What are you reading? Probably Macbeth, I don't know. But, I think that then you spend that time getting to know your students, and you spend that time saying, okay, well, what can you tell me about the text that you're studying? Which maths topics do you feel confident in? And essentially, I think you're spending your time the same way. Essentially, you are doing an initial assessment just in a slightly sort of less structured manner, and in a way that can be really nice, because obviously you're talking to your students about things that they feel confident or not so confident on, rather than seeing it all written down on paper. But on the other hand, students are not always the best judge of what they're good at and what they're not good at.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to have to draw it to a close there because we're coming up to 11:59. So thank you, Beatrice. In fact, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Johnny, Sharon, Jen, George and Beatrice. And let's just ask Julia for her thoughts to wrap it up.
I think that this has been a really, really rich session where we've just been chewing over what works. And thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and expertise to the table. All we want to do is have more of these conversations, because the more we do that, the more our delivery is going to improve and our students are going to benefit. So I just want to invite you to continue to be part of our conversations as we go forward. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, George. Thanks, St John. Thanks, Beatrice. And thanks, Jen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Nice seeing you.
Yeah, feel free to stay. We're about to introduce Lee Elliott Major, and we're going to have a little further discussion, panel discussion on how to make sure that the next stage, the next phase of the NTP is going to be serving our least advantaged students. Ludo, shall I hand over to you to welcome?